What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2013 Volvo XC90 P2. Today on the XC90 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your serpentine belt and water pump. This is going to be applicable to all Volvos equipped with the 3.2 liter inline six. And as most of you may know already by clicking on this video, this is the notorious serpentine belt that is buried pretty much in the middle of the engine bay. You have a new water pump, which also gets coupled to the power steering pump. So it's going to be a cool DIY to get into. We're also going to be replacing the belt idler as well as the belt tensioner. We have some fresh Volvo coolant and a new expansion tank cap, as well as the hardware to secure our water pump onto the block. Typically, the service interval for this, or the max interval, is 150,000 miles. But the best thing to do if you're not sure if yours has been done before is simply to just take a look at the vehicle, take a look at the belt, and see what kind of condition the belt is in. Of course, if you have a water pump leak, then you're going to want to go ahead and tackle this job anyways. In front of me, we have a genuine Volvo kit, which is available on fcpo.com, along with a couple other variants depending on what kind of price point you want to tackle this project at. But before we get started on this DIY, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this DIY, you're going to need your basic ratchets and torque wrenches. One thing I highly recommend though is a ratchet that has a swiveling head. There's a lot of tight spaces in this engine bay, and those are going to come in handy, which we'll show you in a little bit. Moving forward, we have a couple set of wrenches that we need, specifically a 19mm wrench and a 17mm wrench. Something that is also nice to have is ratcheting 10mm wrenches. Ones with swivel heads are even better. Ours is not a swivel, but it will get the job done. Something else that we recommend are a set of pick tools. We have a different array of pick tools here, along with a flathead screwdriver. We have some bungee cords, which we're going to use to suspend our AC compressor. Power tools always make jobs a little bit easier if available, but they're definitely not needed for this DIY. Some of the specific sockets you're going to need are going to be 13mm all the way to 7mm sockets. We have a couple different ones for both the 1/2 inch, 3/8, and 1/4 inch drive ratchets. We're going to recommend you have a T40, a T30, and a T25. Along with that, we also have these two tools over to my right, which are only going to be needed should you decide to tackle the while you're in there approach on this DIY. And what I mean by that is when we have everything apart, we're going to inspect this car a bit further. There is a alternator decoupling pulley and a seal that live in the same area where we will be working. And if those look like they have been leaking or are actively leaking, then we'll tackle that job. But we'll decide that once we get in there. If you are going to be doing that job, you're going to need CTA 1072 and a large 1/2 inch drive socket. This happens to be a 25mm socket. That will help drive your new seal in. And lastly, a vacuum fill tool from UView. We recommend whenever you're doing a Volvo cooling system to vacuum fill it. You can go the traditional old school way if you do not have a large compressor or this tool, but we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to the DIY. And something that we don't have pictured here, but you will need is a catch pan or some sort of receptacle for the coolant that we will be draining from this engine. Now with that, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, first things first, before we get started up front, we're going to start by disconnecting the battery first. So we've hopped over to the rear of the XC90. We're going to lift up our trunk mats, open up the covers back here, and undo our battery. There's usually a cover on them. If your vehicle does not have the cover, I would suggest getting one just to be safe. This simply lifts up. We have two small tassels to undo on either end. Volvo's kind enough to include an image on how to do that right there. Then with that, you can lift this up. I'm just going to go ahead and move that so it keeps everything up and out of the way. Our battery is located under this cover, which is held in by 3 13mm pieces of hardware. We have 2 bolts and 1 nut that secure that cover. So let's go ahead and pull those off first. Now we have our covers off. We have access to the battery. We're going to start by undoing the 10mm nut on the negative terminal. You don't have to back this nut off all the way. Sometimes they're not designed to come off all the way, but it's simply a pinch here using a pinch bolt and a nut to secure the terminal to the car. So we're just going to go ahead and loosen it up a bit, pull that up. Always start with your negative terminal first, then we can hop over to the positive and do the same 10mm nut on this side. Just loosen up that pinch bolt And then we can remove that. Okay, now that that's secured, we can hop up front and start the next part of this DIY, which is going to be draining our coolant. So let's do that now. So before we get started, it should go without saying, but you always want to be sure that you're working on a nice cold engine, especially when you're messing with any coolant or fluids coming out of the engine. In this case today, coolant is going to be our number one. So we have a nice cold 3.2 liter in front of us. We're going to start by removing the expansion tank cap. This will break the vacuum seal so that when we drain everything, it drains nice and evenly. So with that off, now we can hop underneath the XC90 and work on draining the coolant. So let's do that now. All right, under the XC90, we're going to start by undoing the 7mm head on the lower radiator hose clamp. This is located on the driver's side of the XC90. We're simply going to undo this clamp and then pull this bottom radiator hose off. Now it's just a matter of working the hose off. We have our catch pan underneath ready to rock and roll. We're going to give that a little bit of time to drain, and then once that's finished draining, we'll put the hose back on and then proceed with hopping back up in the engine bay. All right, to get started up here in the engine bay, we're going to work on removing our air box and a couple other components up here that'll give us more room to get to our AC compressor, our power steering pump, and our water pump. So, for starters, if you still have it, be sure to remove this top cover first. This one's broken, but it has 4 tabs that secure it to the body of the airbox. Ours is all broken and loose, so we're just going to go ahead and pull that off. Next, we're going to work on disconnecting our ECU harness from the ECU. Again, we already undid the battery. For that, you simply pull these tabs forward. Now make sure that these tabs come out when you pull the red lever all the way out so that it unlocks the connector. If these haven't been off in a very long time, oftentimes they can be pretty stuck. Dirt and grime usually seizes them up. So just be very gentle with it, be patient. You should be able to work it off. While we're here, we want to disconnect our mass airflow sensor, which is located on the back side here of our tube. It just has one small gray tab that locks it into the sensor itself. And that tab's going to be located right here in front of the power steering reservoir. You're going to press that in and just pull the connector down. Once we have that disconnected, we can undo our hose clamp that goes to the intake tube. You can use a flathead screwdriver or a 7mm socket to undo that. We'll just use a flathead screwdriver. And then we have a total of 5 T25s that go around the airbox that we want to zap out so that we can remove the top half of our airbox. Then we have 2 on this side, one which we are missing, and one that sits on the very corner here. Then with that, we can pull this lid off, disconnect it from our tube, and just gently set this to the side. From there, we can pull the filter out if we'd like. Good time to inspect it. This one looks fairly clean. It's only from last year, so it probably wasn't replaced too long ago. And then we can go ahead and pull out the bottom half of the airbox, which is held in by one plastic 10mm nut over here that just kind of guides it. Just be mindful of that when you pull up on this. And we have this front tube, which clips into the box. There we go, that's out. And we can also go ahead and pull this out, which is held in by 2 10mm nuts. And this will come straight up. I'm going to go ahead and feed these 2 10s back here into my radiator support just so I don't have to worry about what goes where, and I know that these are going to go right here once we come back to this point. While I have you up here, we're also going to go ahead and pull this beauty cover off. This simply lifts up, and we can set that to the side. And from there, you can choose to remove this intake pipe, which is held with a similar clamp, just like the one up here, down below on the throttle body, or you can just kind of work with it moving around. So we're just going to go ahead and work on removing this next. We have one 7mm clamp that we can access from the top. So let's get that one out now. We're just going to use a long extension to get to this one. A long flathead screwdriver will also work. All right. Now we're gonna hop underneath the car and try to access the other clamp from underneath. And we're gonna go ahead and reach our arm on the passenger side of this front subframe support here and just sneak our little hands in, or our big hands in this case, along with a 7mm socket on our 1/4" ratchet. And we should be able to get that other clamp off no problem.
Good.
So while we're in here, we're gonna go ahead and use a flathead screwdriver just to work this boot off of the throttle body a bit so that when we're up top, we don't have to pull on it too much. All right, well, as long as we can jostle the seal down there a bit, we should be able to pull the pipe off from up top. So let's do that now. Now that that's come off, we can go ahead and pull this intake tube straight out. The reason we undid this hose clamp before is so that this silencer, which sits in here like this, wouldn't block us from pulling this out. So it just makes life a little bit easier. I recommend you undo it. And it's an easy to get to clamp. So now that we have that intake tube out, we can focus on some of the items up here along by the AC compressor. So first thing on the list is 2 8mm bolts to remove our power steering reservoir. So let's do those now. And we can go ahead and move this bracket around. I'm gonna go ahead and slide the bracket off of the reservoir. It's got one metal tab here that kind of locks it into place. Just slide it down. I should have pulled this off first, but there we go. Then I recommend whenever you place brackets or anything down, try to keep it with the items that they go with. You could argue this could have stayed on this metal bracket, but it just makes life easier. So that's gonna come off. Now we have a 10mm here that we're gonna go ahead and zap out. This is a long bolt. We're gonna make sure it goes back up here. It also helps hold the AC compressor to the bracket. We have a 13 up top of here that we wanna remove. And we have one more 10 located underneath the power steering reservoir, which we wanna get out as well. For that, we're just gonna use the ratchet, a little bit of a tighter spot, make it free. We should be able to pull it out. And once we have this undone, we can remove this upper bracket. On the XC70s, sometimes you have another bracket that sits over this arm, which is held in by just 2 fasteners. Go ahead and remove that, and then you can access this upper bracket and pull it off. All right. Now we're gonna work on loosening the belt tensioner and locking it so that we can proceed with this DIY. We're using a 19mm wrench, and we're gonna show you the nub on where you're gonna mount it on the belt tensioner to loosen the tension. Just looking at the new unit here, you can see these come locked from the manufacturer. We're gonna use a 3mm hex or Allen to lock our old one, but your 19 would essentially go somewhere like this, and then you can use that to rotate everything. So you have 2 spots that you can choose from. It may vary from vehicle to vehicle which nub you can actually get to, but a 19 fits nicely over that. Place this Allen in here to be ready to rock once we do compress this tensioner down. Now with that, our belt is nice and loose. We can pop it off. Either pulley is fine. And on initial inspection, we can see just how truly terrible and dry rotted this original 139,000 belt is. So nearing definitely the end of its life. But with that, that'll allow us now the ability to unbolt this AC compressor and get it out of our way. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. Now we're gonna work on removing the next 2 10mm bolts that continue to hold this AC compressor to the mounting bracket. We have 2 electrical connectors on here, which we're gonna undo just to give this AC compressor a little bit more slack. It's already a tight squeeze in here with them. We have 1 tab on the front, and then the second one has a tab on the back side of the compressor, or facing the back side, if you will. And with that, we might have just a little bit more wiggle room so that we can bungee cord this up and out of our way, something like this. So with that, we're gonna grab something to situate ourselves and have this AC compressor hang out here, and then we'll pick it up in just a moment. All right, now that we have the AC compressor out of the way, I went ahead and just bungee corded it over to the front of the radiator support. We're gonna work on removing the AC bracket. This is gonna be critical so that we can A, replace the old belt tensioner, and B, replace the belt itself, and it gives us a little bit more room to work with. So let's move over to the AC bracket and get this thing out. First, we're gonna go ahead and just crack free this 10mm bolt. This holds the tensioner to the AC bracket. That way, when the AC bracket is out, we're not fighting it and having to put it in a vise or anything like that. We can just remove it easily the rest of the way. That's gonna be nice and loose. We have a 13mm bolt down here that we're gonna wanna zap out. With that one undone, we have an 8mm bolt down below that holds the harness to this bracket. We're gonna undo that one next. That'll free that up. You can put this 8mm back in the bracket just so we don't lose it. And then following this bracket back, we have one more 13 to undo on the end there. So let's go ahead and get that one off next. We have one more 13mm bolt that is holding this AC compressor in place. It's located on this XC90 on the front of the block. You're gonna see there's a ton of oil. We're gonna hit it with some brake clean and show you a better shot from underneath of what that looks like. But it's a 13mm bolt that we're gonna reach up from up top and get out, and then this bracket should come out. So I'm using a 13 on a small 3/8 drive extension with a 3/8 drive ratchet. And we're just gonna go fishing for the bolt, see what we get. That last 13 out, we should be able to pull this bracket out. And here we go. We have some crusty goodness. We have our old belt tensioner. Here's a better look at how it looks like when we lock it. Again, we use a 3mm Allen. We'll clean this up before we reinstall it and before we install our new tensioner. But for now, let's continue on and just go ahead and set this to the side, and then we'll pick it back up later. With that out, we're gonna work on removing the belt tensioner next. So we're gonna go ahead and grab our 3/8 drive ratchet. We have a small extension along with our T40, and we're just gonna go ahead and remove that now. Our new one comes with a new piece of hardware, so we don't have to worry about tracking this hardware or losing it. But if you're not replacing it, then I recommend you hang on to it and keep it with the pulley. All right, on here is our old idler. We're gonna set this to the side. We have a new one ready to rock. These are original, and this one's pretty loose and noisy. So we're gonna definitely replace it since it comes with our kit and since it is needed. But now we have that off, we have a little bit more room to work with. Our next step is gonna be to separate the two T25s. So we have one right here, and we have one on the complete opposite side right here, and this is bolted to the clock spring, if you will, that engages against the water pump. So we're going to undo these two next before we continue on removing the power steering pump itself. So let's grab our T25 and get to it. Now we have a little bit more access to our power steering pump pulley. I'm going to show you how I'm going to route my T25 through the pump itself to remove the two screws that hold the power steering pump pulley to the coupler in between the pump. You can also use a 90-degree T25 if you don't have a socket bit like we're using today. Either one's going to be fine. These are only torqued to 5 Newton meters, so they should come off without having to counter hold the pulley. But let me show you what that looks like in here, and then I'll get in your way and remove the two T25s. There's one T25 out. Now we're going to go ahead and rotate this 180 degrees and just repeat the same steps. Now we have the power steering pump separated, or at least unbolted, from the spring decoupler on the water pump. We're going to work on unbolting the power steering pump from the transmission here so that we can move it back underneath the ABS module and give ourselves some room to get to our water pump. So with that, we'll grab our tools and we'll get ready for this next. All right, next on our laundry list, we're gonna work on removing our power steering pump. There's a bracket on the back of it held in by two 10mm bolts that we're gonna start with, and then we'll go from there. So a ratcheting wrench is gonna be your best friend for this bit. So let's go ahead and get to it. We have one more 10mm down at the bottom that we're gonna work on removing next. We have one more sneaky 10mm bolt. We're gonna show you a shot of it first. We're gonna be looking over the ABS pump on the back side of things, and then we're just gonna dive into there and kind of block everything. So let me show you what it looks like, and then we'll get to it. And now we're tasked with the difficult task of moving this pump back enough to give us access to the water pump and the coupler. In here, we have one plastic pin. This needs to be replaced. It's usually included with either this coupler or the water pump, but we definitely recommend you replace this. As you'll see, it's part of the kit that we have on the table. And pull this belt out so it's out of our way. And then we have access to the coupling element here, which is just clipped on one side. Right here, you can see the spring going into the front of the water pump. That just comes out. Not the end of the world if you can't get it out, but it would make life a little bit easier. We're gonna try using a small pick just to convince it to come out. Here we go, coupling elements out. One end of the spring goes into the water pump. We'll give you a better view of that on the table. But with that, now we have access to the hardware that holds our water pump on. So let's get ready to remove that next. Now with that, my good people, we have 6 10mm bolts to remove that hold the pump to the block. I do have a catch pan situated under the car for any coolant that may spill out of there. We're gonna try our hand at a 1/4" drive ratchet with a shallow 10mm socket. So let's get to it. For this last one, I'm breaking it free with a ratcheting wrench as it fits in a little bit better. It's a bit of a tight squeeze between the bolt and the transmission to get a full socket in there. So break it free, a couple turns, and then we should be able to get it by hand the rest of the way. And now with all those removed, we should be able to pull this pump off. Still feels pretty good for 139,000 miles. Definitely original. Very minute play in the bearing, but obviously we're gonna replace it while we have it out. We're gonna let that drain for a sec, but we're also gonna go ahead and pull out that old gasket. I'm just gonna use a small 90-degree pick to get it off. The goal here is not to mar the surface of where it goes on or scratch anything. We don't want to cause leaks in the future. We're simply just going to stab the gasket itself, and we can work on prying that out. All right, here's our old gasket. Again, not in terrible shape, definitely flat, but we're just going to go ahead and continue on with the steam, grab our new gasket and feed it into place. Obviously giving the surface here a wipe. There shouldn't really be anything on it as it was a tight seal up against the block. But with that, let's grab our new gasket and get that on there. Now we're gonna go ahead and feed our new gasket in. It's gonna sit nice against the block. There is a little cutout, a little cutout on the block and a little notch on the gasket that helps key it into place. You can see a little tab right at the top. Use a little bit of the coolant spewing out of the block here just to lubricate the outside of the rubber seal. And with that, we're going to use our old water pump to reference. We have this flat spot that points towards the back of the block. And we're just going to use the old markings to tell us which way this goes in, which is going to be like this. Again, flat spot facing the back of the block. I have our 6 new 10mm bolts ready to rock and roll. It's going to go something like that. And we're just going to get these started by hand. Sorry for blocking the view for a moment. But the goal is to get them situated without disturbing the gasket, pinching it, or letting it fall out of place. These 6 10mm bolts get torqued down to 17 Newton meters. For some of them, we'll be able to get a torque wrench on them. For some of them, we're gonna have to trust the old calibrated wrist. We have our torque wrench set to 17 Newton meters. We're gonna go ahead and torque all 6 10mm bolts down. If you can, do them in a crisscross pattern. Let's get to it. For these bottom two, we're gonna trust the wrist as we can't really get the torque wrench in there, but you can get a really good feel for them once they're tight. That's nice and snug there. 17 Newton meters is not a whole lot. It's a small gasket that you're compressing. You get the drill, my good people. That will do all 6. We'll throw that one a mark, even though we can't see it, we can feel it. And now with that, we can install the coupler element or the spring coupler. So let's do that now. Here's our new one. Again, our spring needs to go in to this hole right here that's designed for that to receive it. And then it just seats itself on the rest of the face of the water pump here. So spring goes on like that. That is situated there. And then we need to install our new guide pin into the power steering pump, like that. And now we can join these two together and bolt them back up. Before we do that, I'm going to take a moment to kind of clean up this area a bit before we continue on this DIY. So I'm going to take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll pick it back up, mating those two together. All right, my good people, at this point, I spent a little bit of time cleaning up the block area here. We're going to go ahead and now join the power steering pump back up to the water pump. We have our coupler in the middle. We're going to take our new belt and we're just going to slide it over the power steering pump pulley, and then we're going to join the two together. It's going to be a little bit of an act just keeping this belt out of our way as we work. And then from there, we're going to take this DIY a step further. We're going to be linking these parts in the description below as well, but you saw how everything was covered in oil in here. The vacuum pump was done previously by the owner of the vehicle, so that was a major reason why everything was coated, but we still had an active oil leak. And we're going to go ahead and do the seal behind the alternator decoupler pulley, as that's the other culprit involved. And while we're in here, this is one of those, while you're in here, you might as well do a job. So we're going to go ahead and tack that onto the list. But for now, let's get this belt on. Let's bolt this power steering pulley back on. All right, so for starters, we're going to slide the belt over our power steering pump pulley. So I'm going to clear this coupler right here. We can push it back. It is spring loaded. All right, it's gonna look something like that. Doesn't have to be perfect just yet. We're gonna make sure that the mounting points for the two T25s are somewhere accessible at the beginning. So this one's pointing straight up. So that way when we get this pump closer, we have a rough idea of where that is gonna be. The pulley itself has 2 notches in it, which will show you that key into these 2 black dowels on the coupler here. So it should only go one way, making it a little bit easier to install. So make sure you line those up as you bring it over. Okay, so if you look closely between the pulley and the power steering pump, you can see those 2 black dowels have made their way through, meaning that our coupler is aligned with the pulley. That's exactly what we want. So now we're just gonna grab our T25s, start both of them by hand, and then we're going to torque them down to 5 Newton meters. And to be quite honest, we're not going to get a torque wrench in here. 5 Newton meters is not a lot, so we're just going to snug them up gently. Okay, that's 2, and then we're just gonna snug them up using the 1/4" drive ratchet. And that should call these 2 T25s good. That's nice and snug. Now let's rotate 180, do the other side. Again, swivel head ratchets for this DIY are the move. It's gonna be kind of impossible to do without. Okay, that one's nice and snug as well. Now we're gonna take our 4 10mm bolts, resecure the pump back up to the body of the transmission, and torque all 4 of those to 24 Newton meters. So to start, we're gonna start with the easiest 10mm bolt to get to, which is this front one that goes beneath the lines here and mounts right there. We're gonna use this to just kind of line everything up properly. Again, making sure that our belt is still just hanging on around the pulley. It doesn't need to be perfectly fit, but we just need to make sure that it stays in place. Okay, we're gonna leave that loose just so we have a little bit of wiggle room. Now we're gonna work on feeding the rearward 10mm bolt, which is arguably gonna be the hardest one. Something I like to do oftentimes whenever I'm dealing with harder reach hardware is do a small piece of electrical tape around the head of the bolt if possible. It keeps us from losing the bolt when we're in a tight to reach spot. And it's just enough tape where it'll hold it, but it's also not enough where it'll keep the socket stuck to it, so you'll be able to pull the socket off of the bolt. So now we're just gonna try to feed this from behind the pump. And the best view for this one is to look over by the brake fluid reservoir and just kind of honestly just aim. It's a little hard to see the location of the bolt, but once you get it, you can feel it go in. Again, we're using a deep 10mm socket with an extension on it. All right, with this one and the front one being on, I'm gonna just keep these tools in place and just snug down the most rearward 10mm bolt now while we have the socket on it. And then we'll go back to the other 3 10mm. That is on there. Let me switch over to my ratchet and just snug it up. Again, 24 Newton meters is not a whole lot, but doing it by hand will be just fine. All right, that one's gonna be nice and snug. Now we can move on to the other 3 10mm, which are easier to get to. And we're installing our supporting bracket. The welded on nut needs to face the pump itself on the bottom portion, and then the thin portion slides up on top, and they just kind of key in with each other, and then we'll feed in the 2 10mm bolts. These are the 2 shortest 10s, by the way. You have 2 long ones which go to the back side and front side of the pump, and then you have the 2 short 10s which go to that small supporting bracket. Okay, and make sure we have a little bit of wiggle room for that bottom one. That one's nice and snug, and now we have 2 more 10s for the supporting bracket. And for the final top one, we're just going to switch to the ratcheting wrench. All right, that's nice and snug. Power steering pump is secured. It is secured against our water pump. Everything feels really nice. It rotates beautifully. That's excellent. That's exactly what we wanted. I'm going to re-zip tie this reservoir out of our way, something like this. And then we're going to focus on removing this decoupler pulley and replacing the seal there. So let's get ready to do that now. So as mentioned before, we're going to go ahead and tackle the decoupler pulley and seal while we're in here. I know this wasn't initially part of the DIY, but we can't go ahead and put this back together with how covered in oil everything was. So that vacuum pump had been sorted previously. If you want to learn how to do that vacuum pump, please be sure to click the link in the description below. We show you exactly how to rebuild it and or replace it. From there, we're going to go ahead and do this decoupler now. So we have our 90-degree pick. Let's get to it. So our first order of business is going to be to remove this cover. Now, obviously, we're replacing this pulley. I'm not worried about damaging anything, but The goal here is to be able to pull this out. So a 90-degree pick is going to be your friend, or something similar that you can use to get in here with. Make sure not to block your light. Pull out. All right, with that off, we now have access to the bolt and the splines where we counter hold to get that pulley off. So show you what that's going to look like. We have our CTA 1072 tool. This is designed specifically to do this job. You can buy just this black socket on its own and then use your own pass-through socket bit or Torx bit to do the counter holding. But this is all in one. Makes life a little bit easier. So we're going to feed our tool in, making sure that the first portion is engaged properly in the head of the bolt that's in there. That's what we're going to be turning. And then we can install the spline bit. That's going to do the counter holding beautifully. You're going to want to use a 17mm wrench, our hands and the body of the AC compressor to counter hold. And then we're going to take a 1/2" drive ratchet and counter hold with the wrench while we break the bolt free with the ratchet. All right, hang on to this bolt. We're going to be reusing it. And now with that, we should be able to pull this pulley off. And you can see how much crud is behind here. Now, yes, again, some of it came from that vacuum pump. And we did clean up a bit here before we got to this part. But I would argue that you can see the bottom of that shaft. That seal is wet. So when this is running, that is actively leaking. So here comes the fun part, which is going to be removing that seal. Before you remove it, you want to pay attention to how deep in the well of the timing cover it is. And you also want to clean up the whole area before you go to remove it. That way you don't risk contaminating anything when you install your new seal. So we're going to do that first. We're going to use some engine degreaser and we're going to clean that up, and then we'll work on removing the seal. So now it's time to remove this seal. There's a couple ways to go about this. You can drill a small pilot hole. Sometimes you can thread in a small screw and then pry the screw out, kind of like you would on a rear main seal. So we're just going to take a small pick and work on piercing the middle of the seal if possible. If not, we'll work at it from the shaft side, but we want to avoid sticking this tool in anywhere near around the outer sealing portion. A little mangled up, no problem. So these seals are lined with steel on the inside and outside. So while this may have looked vicious while it was going in like this, all we were doing was just catching the inside lip. We were never marring up the timing cover. So with this out, we're going to go ahead and clean that up. Just a quick spritz of some brake clean is fine, or a towel, whatever you wish to use. There is a seal driver tool designed to install these seals. To be quite honest, we do not have one here in house. It's not something we do quite often. And I imagine, like yourself, you're not going to have one as well. If you do have it, there's a couple of great videos online that show you how to use that tool. But the basic idea of it is that it threads in, and then you pull a socket-sized cylinder over the seal to drive it in. We're going to do something similar, just using a regular old socket. So we're going to get our new seal, lube it up with a little bit of oil, and drive it in. We have our new seal. It's coated in a little bit of liquid moly engine oil. We're going to slide that over gently, trying to get it as even as possible. And then I have a 27mm socket. This is a 1/2" drive socket that we're just going to use to kind of help drive the seal in, like so. We're going to line it up like that. We're going to very gently tap it in with our hammer. All right, the goal is to make sure that the seal is not crooked in here, that it looks nice and even. And from what I can see here, it looks pretty good. I'm gonna run our finger across the edge, make sure we don't feel a raised end anywhere. I'm gonna take our new decoupler pulley, and we're gonna slide that over the end of our shaft here. Now we're gonna take our bolt once more. Ours is still hanging out on our removal tool. We're just gonna go ahead and feed it in and thread it by hand. And then we're going to go ahead and torque this down to 80 Newton meters. Okay, now that's nice and snug. You can slide in the spline then. And similar to how we removed it, we're going to counter hold with a 17mm wrench. Just going to rest it up against the transmission bell housing here if possible. It's going to turn a bit, and we're going to set our torque wrench to 80 Newton meters and just tighten it down. We're going to let that wrench spin a little bit just so it bottoms out, which is completely fine. There we go. And your new Schaeffler bearing comes with, or pulley comes with a new cover. This just presses on. It's a pretty snug fit. There we go. Beautiful. Now we're going to install our new idler pulley. This is held in by a T40, and we're going to torque this one down to 24 Newton meters. Make sure to start it by hand first. Then we'll use a T40 bit to snug it up by hand. There we go. With that in place, we can slowly start to route our belt kind of how we want it. So we have a rough idea of how it's going to go. And now with that, we can work on reinstalling our AC bracket. So let's clean that up a bit and then get that ready for install. Before we install the AC bracket in once more, we already removed the 10mm bolt that held in our old belt tensioner. Now we're going to take our new one, which has a notch on it right here on the back. And that just keys into the body of this bracket. Then we'll feed our 10mm bolt through once more. That's going to go something like that. We're basically just going to get it started by hand. And we're going to snug it up by hand all the way. We're not going to tighten it until it's back on the vehicle and the bracket's bolted down. So that's going to look something like that. We have our tensioner still keyed so that it can go on the belt. We have our 10mm bolt started so that we can keep that tensioner in place. And now we're just going to simply feed the bracket back in, line it up with the dowels. At this point, for you good people with the older models, you're going to need that alignment tool to align this bracket in place while we're redeeming themselves a little bit towards the end, giving you dowels to line everything up. So let's feed this in and get to it. As you feed this bracket in, make sure the belt sits over on top here so it can go over the belt tensioner. I'll show you what I mean once I get this somewhat in place. And make sure it's on our power steering pulley and the coupler pulley as best as possible. That looks good there. We're going to start the 13 up top here. That just feeds through the very top. That's the easiest one to get to. And we'll just start that one by hand. And then from there, we have one more 13 on this specific vehicle that follows the front of this bracket. So let's go ahead and feed that one in next. These three 13mm bolts get torqued down to 24 Newton meters. If you can squeeze a wrench in there, torque wrench, that's going to be your torque spec. Again, we're going to handle this similar to the power steering pump, where the top two will be easy to torque down. If we can get a torque wrench on this bottom one, we will. But three 13mm bolts, they're 24 Newton meters. And for the tensioner pulley, 10mm bolt, 24 Newton meters as well. All right, we're going with the old calibrated wrist for this bottom 13. That's nice there. These top two we can go ahead and torque down to 24 Newton meters. There we go, 24. Now we can bring our AC compressor down while also feeding our power steering, while we also feed our serpentine belt over the pulley. So it's going to be a bit of a song and dance here, but we should be able to have enough slack from the tensioner being detensioned at the moment to get that on. And now it's just a matter of lining up the dowels from the AC bracket, making sure those look good and flush. And that is wonderful. So now that we have our AC compressor lined up, our dowels are in place, our belt looks good. We have two 10mm bolts that we have handy right now. The longer one is going to be your bottom left, if you will, or the one most closest to the radiator. Then we have the shorter of the two 10s that goes on the back. Our third bolt is going to be installed once we bring over that bracing bracket that goes from the cylinder head to the AC compressor. So no worries just yet on that. For now, we'll start these two 10mm bolts and torque them down to 24 Newton meters, just like the bracket. There's two. And while we're here, we're going to be sure to reconnect the two electrical connectors that go to the AC compressor, so we don't forget those. We have one, that's the single, that's the most forward one. And then we have the double, which goes on the back side towards the strut tower. There we go. Now with that situated, we can go ahead and detension or retension our belt tensioner by removing that pin. To do that, we're still going to use a 19mm wrench to take the initial load off using those existing nubs. You actually may be able to get it from the top this time. There is two nubs on this tensioner. All right, so we're going to push down on this and pull out that pin. And the belt tensioner can do its thing, and that belt is nice and tight. Now with that, we're going to grab the supporting brace that goes over the front. So let's do that next. Now we're going to install our bracket once more. Here's that third AC compressor bolt. I'm going to slide that underneath our harness. We'll feed that compressor bolt just to act as the centering point here. That's a 10mm bolt. We have a shorter 10mm bolt that comes down here. We're going to torque the first 2/10 to 24 Newton meters. And then we have 113 up top that also gets torqued to 24 Newton meters. And with those, we're just going to take a moment to mark them all. That way we know that they're torqued up. We know they're not going to move around on us. And if for some reason they do move around on us, then we'll know exactly. All right, we have a small bracket that holds our power steering reservoir in place. That's held in by two 10mm bolts. We're going to go ahead and line those up here just like that. And these we're just going to snug up, but if you want to torque them, they get torqued down to 10 Newton meters. Again, they're two small 8mm bolts, 10 Newton meters. With that situated, we can now free up our reservoir from jail. So I have one zip tie down here, holding it in place still. And we can just reclip our reservoir back into its bracket here, just like that. Now with that, we can grab our plastics and our air box. So let's go ahead and get ready for those. All right, now at this point, we're gonna go ahead and install our intake tube once more. Again, we have our clamps ready to go. It is still without the silencer. That's the only way to fit it in here. So we're gonna go ahead and feed it in and then get kind of close and feed the silencer back in so we can snug that up. So let's do that now. All right, that tube can sit something like that. I'm gonna grab this. I'm calling it a silencer. Let me know in the comments what it's actually called. Usually cars, when they have something like this, it's just to muffle the intake noise. I don't believe it's helping with the flow. But now we're gonna key in this piece. Careful with this connector up top here. Goes to a vacuum line. We'll fight that a little bit more once the pipe is secured onto the throttle body. So for now, we're gonna get it close and we're gonna hop underneath the car and feed the pipe onto the throttle body. With the pipe fed in, we're gonna reach in and do our best to try to mount it around the throttle body. It's gonna be a bit hard to do that from underneath the car, so we're just gonna go for it, grab it as best as possible, and make sure it seats all around. We'll be able to check the bottom half once we get underneath to do the clamp. There are little stops, if you will, on the throttle body that will butt up with the intake pipe once it's seated all the way in. We'll handle that silencer last. For now, let's hop underneath the car and make sure that our intake pipe's all the way on, and we can tighten down that hose clamp. With our intake pipe all the way on, we can go ahead and tighten down this clamp using a 7mm socket. I find it easiest to use one of those. The trick here is going to be to keep this from dancing on us while we tighten down this clamp. You can reset the clamp back in its original position if you'd like, or you can just set it up somewhere where it'll be easier for you to grab on, especially if you're going to be back in here in the future. So for us, that'll be somewhere down here. For now, we just need to tighten it up a little bit more so we can get rid of some of the slack so that it doesn't spin around on us too much. Right, hose clamp feels good, nice and tight. Our silencer looks like it's seated all the way nicely up against the intake tube up top. So we're gonna go ahead and handle that one from up in the engine bay once more, similar to how we removed it. So let's do that now. We're just gonna tighten down the clamp for the silencer now. We have an array of extensions. You can use a long flathead screwdriver. I'm using extensions with a 7mm socket on the end. I'm gonna counter hold the clamp with my other hand so it doesn't spin. Let's do the good thing. Now we're going to install the lower portion of our airbox, and we have one plastic 10mm nut that helps secure it in place here. Now we're going to install our front air duct. Remember, we left the old hardware in place. I'm going to go ahead and pull that out now. Slide this in, making sure that this end keys back into the airbox. Then we can reinstall our two 10mm bolts. We're just going to snug them down using the air ratchet, or the electric ratchet, I should say. Can't remember the last time I used an air ratchet. Next, we can drop in our air filter once more. Then we can install the upper portion. Can't forget to replug in our mass airflow sensor, of course. And get ready to snug down the 5 T25s that bolt us to the top of the airbox. And you have one more that sits up here. This airbox is missing it. The box itself is in pretty rough shape. We have two electrical connectors that go to our ECU. Make sure we bring those back up. Your harness can clip back into the airbox here if you still have that rubber grommet, or you can zip tie it. We'll plug this in, and we'll lock it in as we go. I'm just going to repeat the same thing on the other side. This side's a little bit worse for wear, as we saw when it came out. Our plastic cover can go back over this, or can it? Yes, it can. And we can't forget to tighten down our hose clamp that goes to our intake pipe for the airbox side of things. Using a flathead screwdriver, again a 7mm hex socket will work. We have a beauty cover that can go back on. Like most cars, these beauty covers have a couple dowels or rubber dowels, either on the valve cover or on the cover side. Everything keys into. On the engine side, you can see the 4 studs to come off of the oil trap here and to come off the front of the valve cover. Now we can just go ahead and put the cover on. Be sure to line up your oil fill cap and pop those on. And with that, my good people, we have 2 things left to do on our laundry list. 1 is to reconnect our battery and wrap up the trunk area. And 2, and most importantly, is going to be to fill up our cooling system. So let's hop over to the trunk first. We'll get our battery situated. That way we can wrap up front. So I'll meet you in the back in just a moment. We're going to go ahead and reattach our battery once more, starting with the positive terminal. We'll get that situated over like that. We'll grab our 10mm nut, snug it up by hand, and then we're going to use our 10mm socket on our ratchet to snug it up. Again, this is just a pinch bolt. You don't need to over tighten this. Once it's nice and snug, trust the wrist. That's going to be good. We'll do the same thing with the negative terminal. Okay, nice and tight. From there, our plastic cover can go back on, just like so. Then we can take our metal bracket, slide that over. We have 2 13mm bolts that we can start by hand up front, 1 13mm nut at the back, and then we're just going to zap them in with the electric ratchet and snug them up. Start with the nut. So that's going to be more than good enough. You can pull this section back down, make sure it's lined up properly. These tassels can get locked back in to lock this cover in place. And now with this trunk area situated, let's hop over to the front and fill our engine with some coolant. All right, my good people, we are at the final step of this DIY, which is going to be refilling our system with coolant. Volvo recommends you do a vacuum fill on these cars. Let me know in the comments below if you fill yours at home without this tool. Not everyone has these, and not everyone has an air compressor to handle these. So more than likely you're just filling it up the old school way. Whatever you do though, without this tool, make sure that the vehicle gets up to temperature. Allow the thermostat to open and cycle all the coolant through. Keep your heater on high. Once you have heat inside the cabin, then you know the coolant is circulating. From there, I would recommend you to let the car get completely cool, maybe wait a day, and then check your level and adjust as needed. But for today, we're going to use the vacuum fill tool. So let's get to it. We have our air compressor hooked up. We have our valves shut. Right now, we're just going to go ahead and pull vacuum until it reaches about 25 on our gauge. I'm going to use a small towel around the breather here in case some coolant sprays out, meaning there may be some coolant still in some of the lines. And then we're going to let it sit for a few minutes to make sure we do not have a leak anywhere. This is another reason why this tool is so great. If you have a leak anywhere, it will not hold vacuum. And once we have that situated, we'll get ready to fill it. We're going to give that a few minutes and then we'll pick it back up in just a moment. All right, my good people, at this point it's been a few minutes. We've checked everything. There's no apparent leaks or hissing anywhere. Our gauge has sat completely still, so that's great news. The goal here is going to be to keep the end of our hose inside our coolant bucket. We have 1 gallon of the genuine Volvo concentrated coolant with 1 gallon of distilled water mixed in here. First, we're going to go ahead and prime the line, and by that we're just going to open up this valve until this line fills up, and then we're going to close it once more. To do that, you're simply going to open and close. Now, this may be sounding extra, but I like to purge it once more just to kind of take up and remove that bit of air that we just let in. I'm just going to cover my nozzle here, press the button down once more. Okay, now we have eradicated any air we may have let in. And from here, I'm just going to go ahead and open the valve in full, keep my other hand on the line, making sure it's submerged fully in the bucket. And we're just going to let the tool do its thing. It's completely normal to see the coolant lines collapse if they are visible to you whenever you use this tool. As the system fills back up with coolant, they'll slowly come back to their normal size. So it's kind of cool to see. It can be a little stressful the first time if it's your first time using one of these tools, but they're definitely the way to go no matter what kind of vehicle you're working on. All right, my good people, at this point, our tool has finished doing its job. It's a fairly quick process. You can also hear it when it's done filling the system. We're just going to lift up this lid here, making sure we don't make a giant mess. I'm just going to pull the airline off. We're going to pull our tool off. And then from here, our kit also includes a new expansion tank cap. Now would be the time to reinstall it. If your level is good to go, in our case, our level is a bit above the max line, so we're going to use a syringe and pull some coolant out. But otherwise, that is going to conclude this DIY for today. In the beginning, might seem a little bit overwhelming getting in there with you have accessories on one side, your engine on the other side, and the belt in the middle. But truly, it is a doable job without doing too much. Definitely a driveway job for sure. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.